Greetings from Toronto. Hi, Sukrita.
Hello.
Hi, viewers. Sangeeta here, back with the ninth episode of the limited video series of literary and critical conversations. Today, we have an important guest with us, Sukrita Paul Kumar, an eminent poet, artist, critic, academic, and editor. On behalf of Setu, I extend a hearty welcome to her.
Thank you.
To present to you the profile of Setu, some quick stats. It's in its 8th year of monthly production with 850 authors, 7,000 published works, 32 printed books, 159 videos, 36 YouTube videos, 40 awards for excellence, and over 36 lakh views. The idea behind running this video series is to showcase the best of the best. Here's a brief and quick intro of Dr. Sukrita Paul Kumar. She is a poet and critic, born and brought up in Kenya. She held the prestigious Aruna Asaf Ali Chair at Delhi University, formerly a fellow of the Indian Institute of Advanced Study, Shimla. She was an invited poet at the International Writing Program, Iowa, USA, and Hong Kong Baptist University. Honorary faculty, Dural Center at Corfu, Greece. She has been a recipient of many prestigious fellowships and residencies. Her recent collections of poems, amongst others, are Vanishing Words, Country Drive with the Canadian poet Yasmin Lada, Dreamcatcher, Untitled, Rowing Together, and Poems Come Home, with Hindustani translations by Gulzar. She is series co-editor of the Writer in Context volumes, Routledge, UK. Her co-edited book on the eminent writer Krishna Sobati is the first in the series. Amongst her many critical books are Narrating Partition and Conversations on Modernism. Her translations include Nude, poems by Vishal Bharadwaj, and the novel Blind, HarperCollins by Joginder Paul. Guest editor of journals such as Indian Literature, National Academy of Letters India, Manoa, Hawaii, and Muse India. She has held solo exhibitions of her paintings. Many of her poems come out of her experience of working with the homeless, street children, and tsunami victims. Her book of selected poems entitled Salt and Pepper has been published recently. With this, I welcome Dr. Sukrita Paul Kumar. Happy to host you, Dr. Kumar, for this episode.
Thank you very much, Sangeeta. I look forward to talking to you.
To give you a feel of her signature poem, let me read out one of her compositions from Salt and Pepper, her recent collection of poems. The poem titled Breaking Silence. Words fall from her mouth as rain on deserts. After storms and cyclones in the heart, words dropping as stones. Words as frozen ice stuck in the throats of lovers. Melting in thought, floating in the mind, words collecting in unuttered sentences. That's that. Well, would you please share with us something about your early life in Kenya, where you were born and brought up, Dee?
Um, well, I think most of it comes out in poetry in a variety of ways. However, if one has to go into the practical narration of it as to how all of that happened, I think the one word that comes to my mind is how my childhood actually created a whole series of imaginary homelands in my head. And primarily, why I say that is because I was born and brought up, as you know, in Kenya, but my father, who was a writer, and my mother was a Kenyan Indian,
I see.
but my father was a refugee from partition times.
Mhm.
And so that is how he landed up in Kenya. Now, his sensibility, his sensitivity to his own homeland, which is obviously India, undivided India, his sensitivity to the idea of going home was looming large over my childhood because there was a constant refrain in no matter what we did. Of course, it was a British colony, Kenya was a British colony, and Nairobi was one of their choicest cities in the world because they did it up so well and it was very comfortable, beautiful city which had very good climate and very kind of urban at a time when uh, development was not the key word for uh, cities in India so much as it is today. So I had all the comfort of the world, but there was a discomfort that we were not at home because he would constantly say, we have to go back home. And I initially used to blame my father for this, that it was he who was a refugee, but he ended up giving us that feel of being a refugee all the time. So, in that sense, I think we were constantly, as Rashti puts it, we kind of were imagining. We, when I say we, I mean the children in the family, myself and my two brothers. We were always thinking, okay, this is transitory, this is just momentary, it's going to pass, but we have to go back. Go back where? We had not been to India, but we imagined that it was a dreamland, it was a utopian, kind of a dream for us to be back home because the whole concept of home was that of my father's. And my mother, too, was kind of swept away with that. And so, in a very broad sense, I'm just giving you a broad essence of it.
Yeah.
However, it did mean that I experienced a lot of life there because I was there for 15 years of my life, but those are the formative years. So,
Okay, so
my school,
at the age
uh,
of 15, you came to India.
yes, yes, I was nearly 15 when came here. And so, practically all my schooling happened there, most of it. And only the last year I came here and to India and I sat for the 12th class board exam, I remember. And so the story is a little strange. And I think for the rest of my life after coming here, I have always been in search of my home and always been in search of my identity, which is how do you home in an identity? It has to be a kind of some kind of evolving sense of who am I, right? And perhaps one of the reasons why I've been writing poetry is that, maybe.
Oh, quite fascinating details.
Mhm. Mhm.
How was your journey then? How did you travel to India and what were your initial impressions?
If you mean physically the journey, that in itself is a story because we used to come by ship.
Oh,
So physically, from Mombasa, which is the port of
mhm.
Kenya, we would sail to Bombay.
I see.
And it used to be a journey of a kind of a voyage of 8 to 9 days being on the sea with no land in sight for several days. So that itself has had an imprint on my imagination and mind in a very significant way, because I have been always like either terrified or extraordinarily happy being on the sea, you know. So it's both. Sometimes you are terrorized as a child when you look that there's no land all around. Where are we going? And what if the ship were to sink? And all of those terrifying stories in the imagination would play up, you know, of ships sinking and so on. And on the other hand, if you were to let go of your imagination without any distraction, because all that you saw was expanses of the sea, blue, green, different colors at different points of time. And I remember standing for hours on the railing at the deck, you know, just looking at the sea and the waves, sometimes calm, sometimes violent, you know, and storms coming through on the way, a breeze which is very strong, sometimes calm. So, variety of experiences in terms of one's own physical self responding and the psychological fears at times. Sometimes, as I said, it was really going ecstatic about the strange kinds of colors visible in the skies and over the ocean and so on. So it was a very, very memorable. Every 2 3 years, my father, my mother, we used to, I mean, they used to pack us up and bring us for 2 or 3 months in the year to come and, you know, visit some homes, some people. And so it was quite an experience. Even the voyage itself, you know, it was like a voyage and quite a contrastive thing from Kenya, which was very different from India. So, so there was that aspect to it. And then, of course, when finally we did come for forever, as it were, at that time too, we had come with many dreams, which my father, in his writerly innocence, you know, he thought that he was the king of the world when he would come to India, you know, and with very meager money, he thought he could buy the whole, you know, he could buy a house. He could. It was such an innocence that he had about all of that. And of course, all of that got shattered in no time, and he discovered that he had to work here, you know, to make money. He needed to work. So there was that whole transition period, which was quite chaotic, very chaotic, because we couldn't take to the heat here. We couldn't understand what summer meant, you know. It was so hot in Delhi. So we had to pack up from here and go to Hyderabad because we couldn't tolerate the weather here in Delhi. And then Hyderabad to then finally we ended up of all the places in Aurangabad. We had never seen that place, but
that's why
we ended up there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it was a difficult period, but the travel continued for quite some time, because after coming here, we were not able to settle down for quite some time, because there had to be a lot of almost a kind of a culture shock also. There was a culture shock. There was a because when we used to come for a holiday as children with our parents, the holiday is always different because you choose the best of places to stay and you have a good time. And yeah, so that was very different, because I remember one holiday we had just come and spent all the time in Missouri, you know, and once we had come, we spent all the time in Shimla. So it was the hills, it was, you know, charming, romantic.
The best places of India.
Yeah. And
Shimla.
yeah, and in the best of hotels and best of, you know, luxury that we. So it was a very different thing from the fact that when we actually came, finally, we needed a house to live in. We needed, you know, practically a whole lot of things which meant running of the house in the same way. So that's where we had problems. But yeah, then of course it went on. My education, this, that started. And
then eventually you settle down
Yeah,
get
settle
used
down.
to the place.
Yeah, but I have to add to this that, not only the question of getting used to the place, but as I was, I knew I was going to be an academic. So I took on to my, honors in English literature, and then, slowly reaching to the idea of doing my PhD. But all of that was on British and American literature.
Oh. Mm.
So that was, in a way, an extension mentally, intellectually, of what I was experiencing in Kenya. But the thing is that my existential angst to know myself, I think, rooted in itself more, because I was not doing literatures of India. I was doing literatures of, not my own country,
American literature
American, and so
study.
on. My PhD is on American literature.
Mm-hmm.
And I was doing well materially. I got a permanent job, etc., etc. But there was this deep angst of rejecting it all at some point. And I shifted completely, and I artificially learned Hindi, Urdu, Punjabi. And Punjabi, I still can't read and write, but I at least can speak Punjabi, and understand it fully. And but Hindi, Urdu, Punjabi was the domain that I worked out for myself, to know the literatures of these languages in order to relate
Mm-hmm.
to my own, what was called my own country. So that is why, and way back when I got a fellowship at Indian Institute of Advanced Study, it was a fellowship to work on modernism in Indian literature,
Mm-hmm.
which is got nothing to do with American and so on, because I shifted then from American literature, and all my subsequent work has been on Hindi Urdu fiction, academically.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, and I think that tells you as to my, journey of trying to locate a sense of belonging, to belong to this place, to settle down, as they say, to settle. And to settle down psychologically for me, I don't know if I'm settled even today. I think I'm still a nomad. I think I'm still a gypsy in my spirit. I still look for the homing of my soul, which I don't know if that homing happens at the end of my life. I don't know. Maybe death is homing. I have no idea. But that becomes a process of exploration. And that exploration of the truth of, or that's having a glimpse of the truth of life, or your journey in life. I think that is why I write poetry. That is why I paint. And I want to connect my creative journey with this particular angst, which was really a certain kind of suffering. But in that suffering, I've homed. In that suffering, I have homed. And therefore, I would like to say that even the series of poems that I did with my experience of working with the homeless people, and then I was writing on that. It was actually my own experience, working out somewhere, trying to sort it out, because I aligned very well with the homeless people, you know. And I ran a shelter. I first collected all of them and then ran a shelter for several, maybe 2, 3 years. It was very, very difficult, the job, because I had little children. I had a lot to do at that time, but I was fully involved in that whole project of working with the homeless people.
Yes.
So that's the whole story that can become a novel at some point, maybe.
Well, so if we talk about literature, I would like to ask you, how are the Bhasha literatures? What do you think? How are they distinct from writing in Indian English? Do you find some major differences
I
or
think we have to,
commonalities?
yeah, I think if this question is even today discussed, which in a way I'm surprised, in a way I'm not, because if I'm also into translation and also having to edit translation several times, particularly because I am not just as a guest editor at Sahitya Academy,
Mhm.
for Indian literature. But even before this, for years, I have been publishing books which have been books of translated collections of translated stories from Hindi and Urdu, and putting them together. For instance, one of them is called Mapping Memories. Mm-hmm. The other one is called A Breakthrough, which I did as a fellow of Indian Institute of Advanced Study. So in that process, I was also looking at translated material from these languages. Now, the difference between our Bhasha literatures and English would be that there is a wide cultural gap. So even in language, it gets demonstrated. Language families are very different, totally different. Now, what happens is then that in one sense, one gets a little alienated using English, but in the process of having liberated ourselves, I would say, at least trying to liberate ourselves from the colonial, what would I say, colonial hangover or process of decolonizing our minds. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not talking about political decolonization. Obviously, it is more to do with psychological and how we have emulated English as in kind of, that's why I appreciate that your Setu is bilingual. I really appreciate that fact. So now what has happened over the last many, many years is that there is a very strong owning of Indian English. Today, we don't laugh at Indian English. There was a time, till about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, people used to laugh at Indianisms in English. Mm-hmm. Today, we know that Indian English is by itself a language to be recognized. That it is like a bhasha of other, languages in India. That owning, I think, is almost there. We are almost there because we've started playing with English language in creativity. That confidence to play with the language, which earlier was seen as abusing English language, today is seen as a creative use of English, right? Mm-hmm. And so, therefore, when we write in English, we don't have that same kind of consciousness, self-consciousness, that we are using a foreign tongue. Mm-hmm. It's no longer a foreign tongue. Today, English, we are able to use English as the language of the streets, because we brought in Indianism. Sometimes even Indian phrases are used in English, because there aren't any
Englishes. We call them Englishes, Pinglish, Tinglish, Hinglish.
Because today, in today's context, you can very much place, within them, if you look at the linguistic map of India and were to supposing look at only English, even then you would see that there is Malayalam English and there is Punjabi English and there are, Oriya English. So it's that itself, there are many Englishes within the country. Mm-hmm. And of course, in the context of the world also, the idea has come to be that there are many Englishes. The African continent would present you another set of Englishes. So there are so many Englishes. And so I think English has got very enriched. And it has been equipped with vocabulary, which was not, in one sense, indigenously its own. Not only vocabulary, even the inflection, nuances, metaphors have been created because all of this material comes out of the cultural context that one is in, right? So from that cultural context, my English, for instance, because there was Punjabi in the house, would have a shadow of my mother tongue. What is my mother tongue? I think I have several mother tongues. I have English as my mother tongue. I also have Punjabi as my mother tongue. And why wouldn't I say that Hindi is my mother tongue? In this country, we cannot have that formula of a single mother tongue. Because there is a multilinguality which is rampant out here. if I say I'm a Punjabi, I can very easily switch over to Hindi or English, or my neighborhood, if it is say Gujarati or whatever, I would have picked up Gujarati also. And in Kenya, that was a language that many of us picked up because there were so many Gujaratis there. So, but of course, there are influences, linguistic negotiations that have happened between one language and another. So, I would not really go back to your question. I would not see English anymore as a foreign language. But yes, if we are saying we are owning that language, then we better have that confidence and better see the autonomy of English in India. The freedom that with which one can use that. So it doesn't mean that it has to be at the cost of the knowledge of the language. Of course, you need to have the language. You need to have the language to be able to play with it. If you don't have the language and then you say, but my Indian English is Indian English, so I can do whatever, I think that would be foolish and naive to do something.
That's true.
Yeah.
The basic knowledge of grammar is essential, a good set of
you need to be somewhere what they call a master of the language to be able to coin new stuff. You need to know the mechanics of that language, right?
Some very valid observations from a well-known poet and editor. Indian literature is exceptional in its canvas, this journal that undertakes literary activities in 24 languages. You are the guest editor there. So, what are the major preoccupations of your craft across the verbal and visual media?
So you're talking about my own, involvement in my writing.
Yes,
in
your
my,
poems
in my,
that you write, the paintings that you do.
Yeah. So I don't know. I have to keep
the
asking
themes
myself
that
this.
you adopt.
Yeah. So I'm not sure I categorize them as, I don't I'm not predisposed to the idea of what themes. It could be anything under the sun that touches me, that takes my fancy in a loose way, one can say that. It could be just a blade of grass that is so luminous early in the morning with the dewdrops on it. I might just be captured by that. It can take the shape of a painting. It can become a poem, depending on what kind of images that get triggered off in my mind when I sit down to write. It could be a sad incident that one may have, or a joyous incident that one may have experienced, but it certainly does need to have some inspirational power in it. And I have to be open to receiving that. Many a times we are so closed that we are not receptive enough. We are not receptive to the novelty of an experience, which seems like very mundane, and we just keep passing it on. Nothing is mundane. It is you yourself. How do you open up your senses? It could be different senses, physical senses of sight, of smell, of taste, that can trigger off, of hearing something, that can trigger off. Now, for the last few days, I don't know if it is going to become a poem or not, but I read an article about the background hum of the universe, that the scientists have discovered that there is some background hum in the universe, which may be caused millions of years ago because of the two black holes coming together into a big explosion, and how those vibrations are reaching us. The hum is reaching us because of what is sound after all. So I'm very fascinated with that whole thing. I don't know, am I going to write a poem on that? Because it's niggling somewhere. It is kind of doing things to me. And what do I do then? I'm now, when I have something like that, a phrase that catches my eye, it could be the newspaper, it could be in life and in a conversation, I would very quickly want to quickly note it down. It could be on a paper napkin in a restaurant. I would note it down. I want to catch hold of that moment of inspiration. And then I don't have to write the poem right away, but that inspiration will come back to me when I look at that piece of paper or my notes. If I were to just see that background hum of the universe, well, it might trigger off a whole series of metaphors. And the poem may not be about space, it could be maybe about the cry of the baby when the baby is born. I don't know to what I will connect it. I don't know. But that process of creativity, for it to take off, I know do need inspiration. Anybody would need that inspiration. But that one moment of inspiration, as they say, you need to have 1% of inspiration, 99% has to be perspiration after that. You engage with it, you struggle with it, you cancel, you delete, you rewrite, right? And sometimes that happens in a jiffy, very fast. Sometimes you may just get stuck and it's half written poem, aborted poem, maybe land in your diary. And I find that sometimes if I look at my old diary or something, I find something and that may be 10 years old or 15 years old. But I make a poem out of it because it all comes back in a different way, right? Your present has already gotten into it and it gets injected into it. And then you get engaged with the process, or it can become sometimes if it's very imagistic, that image can take over the form of a painting. I just go sit at my, on the empty canvas, and that image comes, and in the process of doing it, the image might change completely. The transformation may happen. But that's the magic of creativity. That's the beauty of creativity. That's the journey of creativity. The mutations that take place, the transformations that take place. And even after it is done, and you put your signature and name there, Sukrita, done. After that, also, 2 days later, 10 years later, you go back to it, you want to do things to it. It's creativity cannot be static. It's always dynamic. And it is dynamic to the extent that to you yourself, who's supposed to be the creator, to you yourself, it appears to be incomplete. I think all good art is incomplete. There is no sense of completion in it. The moment you go to Picasso's painting or anyone's painting, that painting to the artist, Picasso, would have been a very different thing. The way you receive it, it goes through a transmutation even in reception. So it's a journey that just goes on and on. That's the beauty of life. That's the potential that life has for us. And we are lucky that we have that kind of as human beings, we have a consciousness with an imagination that can take creativity to places. But of course, once it's done and you're back on the mundane plane, you can become a devil again.
Interesting. And now I recite one of your poems titled Pathetic Fallacy. Rains hissing and lengthening in the fog of silence, snakes waking and rising out of my soul. What a fine figurative use of language. Short and very precise.
And actually, if you were to see the poem, it's also a visual, because it could be just, I think, one or two words in one line. if you were to see the poem,
one word.
Yeah, one word is one line or something. So it
Yes.
just goes vertical like that. So visually, it is occupying maybe half a page or more.
Mhm.
And otherwise, the words can be written in one line, right?
Yeah.
Horizontally, if you were to do. So I remember when I was doing this poem, and I don't know, a friend or somebody walked in and said, well, so how are you doing this? And I don't like when people comment when you're in the process of writing.
Mhm.
However, it gave me a chance to pause and think, is it making sense the way I'm writing it? But it actually came like that. The poem came like that.
Mhm.
The line stopped with the first word, and then the second word in the second line, the third. It just stopped. It didn't want to continue at that point.
Mhm.
And so I think the whole notion of what we call concrete poetry, which is kind of also visual, it has something to do with that. Now in this, the visual matters. You need to pause. You need to pause in a significant way before you go. And yet there's a connection between the first line and the second line. Hopefully, it's all connected. So it's very interesting to see how these things, they just sometimes seem to happen on their own. And sometimes you have to find that mode of, creation. Sometimes you have to look for it. You have to search for it. And you get stuck if it doesn't come very easily. Just feel stuck. Or you might start using superfluous words, too many words, to say something which is very loaded and comes through better through silence between the two words rather than through words. So it's interesting, because I have been an academic for a long time. So sometimes when I pause and think about this, in the moment of creation, I will not think, and I do not, of this kind of questions or whatever. But as an academic, as an afterthought to creative writing, when I look at it, sometimes I get into the academic mode of looking at my poem as somebody else's poem and then thinking about it, critiquing it, analyzing it. Sometimes I do that, not too often.
That's how the process goes.
Yeah.
And only then the final outcome is one that you are satisfied with.
Temporarily.
Yeah. Because I have a quote before me that says the same that you said just now, that temporarily.
Yes.
Well, here I would like to quote you from your recent poetry collection, Salt and Pepper. Selected poems. Quote, a poem may rise and look you in the eye to demand a reworking. As you start engaging with the process, the trajectory leads you to even writing fresh poems rather than carrying on with the selection of older poems. It is complicated, unquote. So that's what you said just now.
Yeah. It is complicated, definitely.
Yeah.
And sometimes you just have to stop at that. Because if you keep working at the logic of it, you'll get nowhere. And yet the process is important,
Yeah.
Process is important.
And each one's perception is different. The way you look at the poem, the way you interpret, the way you perceive, it all depends on your experience of life.
Yes.
And the depth of your reading and knowledge, right?
Yes.
Now, please tell us about your recent poetry collection, Salt and Pepper. What was the immediate inspiration behind it? Some overarching themes?
Well, this Salt and Pepper is not really a fresh creation because this is a selection from my older poetry, right? It's a selection of poems from my older, it's called Salt and Pepper Selected Poems. So I'm selecting from the body of poetry that I've created already, right, over the last 30 years or whatever. So I've been picking up poems from there. However, if you notice that there is some kind of, I don't know how I worked it out, but some kind of an organizing principle that I have worked out in that. And if you notice, in fact, even I need to go back to it to notice it. I start with the first section that I have actually worked out is called the potter's soil. It's the potter's soil. And then on the wheel, and then fire of meaning. These are the sections I have, right? And the last one is across line and time. Now, why do I have these sections? I think there itself, I don't know what the reader might surmise or the critic might surmise. But to me, I didn't want to organize it in any other way. I'm seeing at my earlier poetry as potter's soil, right? The potter is sitting down with the soil or the clay, rather, and then you don't know what are you going to do with that. It's only later that you get onto the wheel, right? And that's the process. You get onto the wheel, and if at all you have to see any chronology, and it's actually the journey of your life. Initially, there is that potter's clay, the material which is raw, chaotic. Then you sit on the wheel and creatively work it out. And then you have to go into the fire of meaning. It is, when some shape is taking place or has taken place, then you put it in the kiln, for it to burnish into some kind of meaningful look. And then you have to transcend everything and grow out of the lines, beyond it, and beyond time. So I've actually done it very instinctively, but I've done that kind of sectional division, and gave, because the publisher, my good friend Hemant Debate, told me, please give it some kind of a form in this collection, create a form out of it. And I'm glad he told me to do that, because then that made me think a little bit. And I said, all right, let's start with the potter's soil, and then put my poems accordingly there. So if at all inspiration, you ask me, where did the inspiration, what was the inspiration? I think the inspiration was only this, that I revisit my poetry. And in the revisiting, I had a lot of problems, which I put that down in my introduction. Because if you're revisiting, then you want to also fiddle with it. Many of the poems, you don't want them to be as they are, So I was restraining myself from doing that. But yeah, I did that. And I just organized it like this, if at all that is called organization. I think it still is chaotic, but there you are.
Well in shape.
Yeah, I hope so.
You are comfortable with both painting and poetry. So, which medium is more preferred when you want to communicate a different mood or a different idea?
I wouldn't really say that there is a preference between one or the other. It would just normally depend on the nature of the initial, the trigger that you have. What is that trigger? And what is making you go to a creative expression? Obviously, I don't write, or paint when I'm commissioned. It's not commissioned work, creativity. The calling has to come from within, right? And sometimes you're in the middle of writing maybe a critical piece, and then you suddenly put it aside and you say, no, but I want to write a poem. I know I don't want to deal with this. And then suddenly I would start writing, So same is true of the painting. But what I'm saying is that the form or the medium, whatever I work with, also would depend on the nature of experience I want to communicate, right?
Mm-hmm.
In both the cases, it's abstract. It's not a concrete thing. That moment of inspiration is not something very concrete. It would be, as I said, if it comes as a big image in my mind, I can see the visual more. If I see the visual more, then it comes out as a painting. But if I begin to see more than that, something else, which needs words rather than just the image will also be part of it. The words also can create images. So then I would bring around, a poem. I would work with a poem because I need words also sometimes. So it would just depend on what is it that is triggering one off into a creative process. So there isn't a preference between one or the other. But yes, it is sometimes more convenient to write. Convenient meaning practical. Like for a painting, you need all the paraphernalia.
Outward factors.
Yeah. So sometimes, but for that also, I think I'm beginning to find some kind of a solution for that, because I have found that there is a software with which you can play around on the computer with that. So when I carry my laptop, if I go for a holiday, then sometimes I use that software to just put down something, as the way I put down an image or something in for my poem, just a phrase. I just put it down, record it, lock it up there. I can go back to it to work on it later. So same I do with the painting also.
Really?
I just put it on the computer, and then when I'm home in a more comfortable situation, when I can use my canvas and brushes, then I can, when I visited the Grand Canyon, last year in 22 or 21, I visited the Grand Canyon, and in that case, I had taken pictures, right? And I took pictures, and yet there was something else that was beyond the photograph. So I used my computer and put it down. Just the lines and little bit. And then when I came back to my home, to my canvas, I did a painting of the same thing. It was a bit different from what I saw. It's not really just the photograph copied or something. No. But at least I captured that little point.
Yeah.
And then at home I worked on it. And I have it in my room now, that painting, right?
Great.
Which is a biggish painting of the Grand Canyon.
Technology comes to your rescue in such circumstances. Yeah.
Like we are talking to each other across the oceans, right?
That's true. That's really wonderful that you do it on computer and then rework on it.
Yeah.
Now I would like to ask you about translation. You have translated quite a few renowned works, and translation, we all know, is a serious exercise where the translator translates not just the landscapes but also the mindscapes. Translation is not merely textual but also contextual. In this context, I would like to ask you, how has been your experience of translating Nude by Vishal Bharadwaj?
Oh, that's it makes a very interesting story, because again there wasn't any deliberate. Vishal has been a friend, and it wasn't a deliberate, conscious choice that okay, I will translate Vishal Bharadwaj. Not like that. I had a fracture, and I was in bed with plaster, and this is I think 2018, if I remember correctly. Yes, 2018. I had plastered leg. I was told to be totally immobile, obviously, because for 6 weeks, and it was. It was in a way going to be torturous, because the house was getting renovated. So, although it was very difficult to negotiate
Oh, yeah.
anything at that time. Anyway, And then it was during that time that Vishal called me and he said, you know what, I want you to look at my poetry and, see, just read and get back. And I'm exploring the possibility of somebody translating, and you would be the best person. So, can you do that, please? So I said, no, I'm down with a fracture. There's that. How can I take it on? And I'm not in the mood to do it. I was feeling sick of the word. And he said, no, you just read and see. And then, so I read the very first, second one, and I liked the style. I liked the struggle of poetry in it. And I said, okay, let me try one. So it was just to try one.
Mm-hmm.
And I tried and looked as though I could simply do it. And that sense of engagement seemed very fine. And it was also a distraction from my sense of being in that, with the fractured leg and the house being in turmoil and everything. So I told him, okay, let me do some, and maybe not the whole book, but I'll do a few. And he said, okay, you start and keep sending them to me, and really great. And I feel very happy. And so, anyway, I started doing, I actually did one a day, because I was all the time on it, right? And so I started doing it. And I think within a month, 4 weeks of my plastered self, went into this. And very happily, and 2 weeks was still remaining with my plaster, within which we edited online, whatever we did that together. And then as soon as I could, he said, we have to get together. We should sit together also once on all this physically. And in my state, I mean, I was better. I'd come out of the plaster. And thanks to him, he organized my visit to Bombay soon after out of the plaster. I went there for two days, and we sat on that whole process of looking through all the basically finalizing the translation. And it happened so fast, it's unbelievable. But obviously, because it had also got something to do with how those words were resonating also. Because if they were not to resonate with me, I would not feel happy, right? So I started enjoying the whole thing, and also the whole process, and also the respect that Vishal has for the translator, because that is very important. And I realized that because I know that my poems, when they were translated by Rekha Sethi, who is a scholar in Hindi, and she translated my poems and the whole book. And I remember telling her, you go ahead and you are at liberty to do what you like. It's you. You have to own the poems. I don't want to make you feel that they are my babies. They have to become your babies, and you have to adopt them. And then you see how you will nourish them. And that respect, I think, is very important to be given to the translator. Only then the translator will creatively work with translation. And of course, the ethical aspect is, to some extent, one has to be faithful to the original. You need to be faithful. But how do you make the faithful beautiful? That is important. For that, the sense of originality has to be retained and recreated, right? The original gets to become another original in another language. So that, I think, was what happened. It happened so fast, and within a month and a half, also the publisher published it. HarperCollins published it. So it was entirely a project of 3-4 months when the book was out. So, and done very, very beautifully. In fact, I have it here. See, very beautifully done. The book was very well done, and the editor Shantanu was very helpful. Yes, Shantanu Roy Chaudhary,
right?
Yeah. So he also got into it, and I think this kind of a thing is always a collective. It is if the author happens to be there, then author, translator, publisher, editor. If
Correct.
this confluence happens well,
Mhm.
and we all see each other
Mhm.
are in harmony, and, then there are clashes sometimes, but those clashes, in the sense, I mean, not this word, not this phrase, let's use that, but you have to see each other's point of view, and that negotiation has to become an easy negotiation. You have to be humble, both as a writer
Mhm.
and as a translator, to realize that you are not always in the right.
Mhm.
So you then negotiate very well in a humble way, but in a competent way and a creative way. And I think that's what we tried to do. And I think the book did well.
And your time was well used.
And my time was used, yes, yes. I got out of the
Yeah.
horrible experience.
Yeah. Congratulations. That's very well done and very prestigious project you completed
It was
during
nice.
your recuperation.
Yeah. And when Gulzar Sahab had translated me,
Mhm.
he translated me, and a book was published by HarperCollins. Poems Come Home. And yeah, I have that here. This is the book that he did, right?
Oh,
This was,
wow.
yeah. So, and how did he do it? It was on one side my English, and
Mhm.
on the other side his Hindustani translation, like
Oh,
this.
okay.
So one side is English, one side is Hindustani. So this book came out also, it was very inspirational in the same
Mhm.
way. He
Mhm.
started doing it, and on the phone, he read out the poem, not telling me it was my poem. And he read it out in Hindustani. And I said, this
Okay.
is very nice, very good. And then he said, Motrima, ye aapki hai. All
Uh,
right. So I said, oh my God, let me hear it again. And
mhm.
then one after the other, he started doing it, and it became a book. So these things happen only when your heart is in the job. Your heart has to be in it. That
True.
point, what we call vaguely inspiration and so
And
on.
this is beautiful. On one page, it is in English, and on the other, it
Yeah.
is in Hindustani.
Yes. Yes. Hmm.
Okay, so in the end, may I request you to quote the quote that sums you best,
I don't like to be framed, so let's not have the quote or anything.
or any
But
message?
I, the best
Or
is that I wrote a poem.
yeah,
Should- I
fine.
think that would be best, because that
Go
would
ahead.
be, yeah. Let me read what? Okay, let me read the poem that I wrote. It's kind of long time ago. And this is called Voyaging at 10, right?
Mhm.
This was my journey from Mombasa to
Okay,
Bombay when we used to come on the sea.
please go ahead.
Voyaging at 10,
Mm.
between awesome expanses of deep blue oceans and the graying sky, I stood, a speck in God's creation, leaning on the rails of the dock, sailing from Mombasa to Bombay. A journey with a beginning and an end, and no middle. A storm,
Mhm.
a swarm of sharks or whales, failure of the engines of Amara, the ship, or a mere giving way of the railing, blue death, anything, a trivial something or a grave lapse. I cannot swim. The shores are not in sight. Thank you.
Very nice poem about your travel, the
Yeah.
voyage, the great transition.
Yes. Thank you.
In the end, may I ask you for any message if you want to convey to the literary audience?
Message, no, but I just want to, because I've always been a teacher, a mentor, and so on, and also learning all the time, from being a teacher. I
Mhm.
think if that doesn't happen, then there's no point. So all I want to say is, I think, just as writing poetry demands tremendous humility and sense of surrender. And that surrender of the egoistic self or whatever, when you start possessing words or decorating words or, become too conscious of your craft at times, can only make you crafty or your poem crafty. I think surrendering is the primary characteristic that is required. And the second is the patience and the receptivity that one needs to have to receive, basically, to be open to receive an experience, creative experience, and then to engage and persevere in the outward expression of it. I'm trying to do that all the time. And I hope that we all join in as a collective to do more and more of that kind of practice of creativity for the universe to be a better, more connected universe of human beings, along with trees and flora and fauna and everything. That's all I have to say.
I hope viewers will definitely benefit from what you have said just now. Thank you so much for your quality time, Dr. Kumar. Thanks, viewers. In our next episode, we'll be here with yet another distinguished guest. Till then, bye bye. Bye.
Thank you, Sangeeta.
Bye.
Thank you, Sangeeta.
Thank you so much again.